Because of the release of the Fazbear Frights graphic novel, I wanted to reread Into the Pit, so it would be fresh in my mind when I read the graphic novel. The reason I did this was partially so I could have it fresh in my mind, but also because I've been planning on rereading it for a while, and it just makes all the sense to read it before the graphic novel. As always, in this video I'm going to be going over any interesting details in the story, some of which may be obvious and some discreet, and at the end I'll be discussing a theory I have about the overarching narrative of Fazbear Frights, a theory that came from this story. This is going to be a two-part series on the connections Into the Pit has throughout the Stitch line. In this video, I'll be reading Into the Pit and discussing a theory I have about a story it connects to, and in part 2, I'll be talking about another story it connects to, and I'll be reading that story for that video as well. I've actually done a video like this for Into the Pit before, and in fact it was the first one I did, but that was long before this series evolved, so I thought it would be a good idea to revisit it. So without further ado, let's get started.
Dreadfully, terribly, something is amiss. But don't you mind the feeling, it's all made up in your head. Destiny's melody calling out to me. But what I need from you is to come closer to the edge.
Number 1. Early on in the story, we are told that Oswald had recently been drawing bear, bunny, and bird animatronics. This is interesting on its own, and it's called out again later in the book when he actually sees Freddy, Bunny, and Chica, since it's obviously a reference to them. But at this point in the story, Oswald has absolutely no idea about the existence of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, and it's also mentioned that Oswald doesn't actually have the slightest clue as to why he's been drawing this stuff. The reason this is important is because in Epilogue 8, Larson has visions of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza coming from the ball pit before ever seeing the ball pit. This seems to show that the pit specifically reaches out to people to lure them in. Number 2. Now, this is a nitpick and it really isn't important at all, but when we are first introduced to the ball pit, it is said that it is filled with red, blue, and green balls. But on the cover, we are shown red, blue, yellow, white, purple, and cyan balls. Hell, there aren't even really any green ones. Again, just a nitpick and it isn't really important, but who cares? Number 3. When Oswald gets into the ball pit for the first time, it's noted that the balls are sticky. In the 9th Fazbear Frights epilogue, it's found that the blood on the balls comes from the same person spanning over 30 different years. This is interesting because it means that at the very least, 30 years go by between 1985 most likely and the epilogues. This has led some people to believe that Into the Pit has to take place in 2015, but the fact that the balls are already sticky and Into the Pit means that it doesn't have to be in 2015, it just has to be sometime after 2015. This also ties into something that I'll talk about in the graphic novel video. Number 4. When Oswald ends up in the 1985 pizzeria and he sees arcade games that to him were old news, it is said that he remembered that they were games that his dad used to play when he was a kid. Later, when Oswald asks his dad what happened to the location that Jeff's Pizza used to be, he very bluntly says that it closed, as if he didn't like to talk about what happened. In Epilogue 8, it's revealed that the ball pit doesn't technically travel in time, but it replaces someone from back in that time with you, meaning you experience that person's memory. Is it possible that the person whose memories Oswald is experiencing are actually his father's? About the memory thing, though, that brings me to my next detail. Number 5. Oswald is able to do whatever he wants in the 1985 pizzeria. He's experiencing someone else's memories, and since he can do whatever he wants, it's also like he's changing the memories, altering them. I think the best way I can explain this is the Joker. So, one of the key aspects of the Joker's character is that no one knows who he is or what his origin story is. That doesn't just include Batman or his enemies, but it also includes the Joker himself. He doesn't even remember. On some occasions, he has an idea of what happens, but every day he remembers it differently. In The Dark Knight, he talks about how he got his scars on 2 different occasions, and on both occasions, he tells it differently. As he puts it,
If I'm going to have a past, I prefer it to be multiple choice.
Sometimes he does remember it relatively accurately, though. He had a pregnant wife, and he was a struggling comedian trying to make money to support her, but he's failing. He tries to make money from committing a crime, but his wife ends up dying and he ends up falling into a vat of acid, becoming the Joker. He remembers his wife as loving him, but really it's just him warping the memory, because in actuality, he was an abusive husband, and his wife was afraid of him, and she actually faked her death to get away from him. He warped his own memory. And maybe I'm looking too far into this, but maybe that's what Oswald is doing. He's affecting another person's memories, warping them into something they're not. But that's just it. Yes, it's a warped memory, but it's Oswald warping it. It's not just warped by itself, meaning there were in fact 6 victims and people did see the bodies. Number 6. When Oswald was out with Chip and Mike for the second time, Mike was wearing a Back to the Future shirt. It's also said that Back to the Future is his favorite movie. Into the Pit takes place over the summer, and Back to the Future came out July 3rd of 1985. That means the time Oswald goes back to is after that, probably taking place in like mid to late July, maybe even later than that. In the novel trilogy, the missing children incident is set to take place in July of 1985, just like in Into the Pit. But in the games, the missing children incident takes place June 26th, not in July. A lot of people say that the missing children incident being 1985 in 2 of the 3 FNaF universes means that it most likely is in the games too, but when both of those universes share the same MCI month but don't share it with the games, who's to say the year is the same too? Also, since the missing children incident is in a different month in the games than the Stitch line, then that goes against Stitch line games, which does put a smile on my face, and people ignore that anyway, so who cares, let's just move on. Number 7. In the missing children incident in this story, if you can even call it a missing children incident, there are 6 dead kids, not 5. We all know that, but people are also screaming and running away, as if people actually did see the bodies. This doesn't match up that much with the actual missing children incident in other games. In fact, this more closely matches up with Save Them from FNaF 2, which is like a highly discredited theory, but it does have merit to it. 6 victims, and people seeing the bodies. Think about that. The Save Them kids were scattered around the FNaF 2 location, meaning people definitely saw the bodies, and Fun Guy confirms this with his scared-sounding phone call in Night 6 of FNaF 2.
Someone used one of the suits. We had a spare in the back, a yellow one. Someone used it. Now none of them are acting right.
And while there don't seem to actually be 6 Save Them victims, there are in fact 6 bloodstains, which allude to a 6th victim even if there isn't one, and that ties into the Pit. This doesn't imply that Save Them took place in 1985, but what it means is that it also doesn't really imply that the missing children incident is either. Maybe I'm wrong, but to me this just doesn't match up as well with the original Missing Children incident than it does to Save Them, even though this is the Missing Children incident equivalent of the Stitch line. But You're the Band, a story that is also in the Stitch line as confirmed in the final Phasma Frights epilogue, talks about how the missing kids were found lined up against the wall. Which also doesn't match up with the games, as the kids were stuffed as they were killed. They weren't all grouped together. And yeah, it's basically explicitly said that they're found, which they are not in the games. Number 8. The detail of Oswald's dad being replaced by Spring Bonnie to me seems important, since in the games William Afton, the killer of the missing kids, used the Spring Bonnie suit, and this Spring Bonnie was obviously the killer in this story, meaning this Spring Bonnie represents William Afton, so what does that mean for Oswald? It seems to imply a connection between Oswald and one of William's kids, maybe Mike, maybe the bite victim, and I don't really know if that's intentionally important detail or not, but even if it is, I don't really know what bearing it has on the lore. Well, or does it? At the end of the story, the courage that Oswald finds in himself to face down against Spring Bonnie to me really seems like a parallel to Mike. Now, I'm not saying that they're meant to be mirror images of each other or whatever, but what if Oswald is meant to tell us something about Mike? Or rather, Oswald and others are trying to tell us who Mike is. This brings me to my next detail, number 9. Near the end of the story, while Oswald and Spring Bonnie have a trial by combat, Spring Bonnie bites Oswald on the arm. But this is not the only story where something like this has happened. In Lonely Freddy, Alec rips the arm off of the Yarg Foxy plushie. In The New Kid, Golden Freddy bites Devin in the arm. And in Step Closer, when Pete dies, he becomes an organ donor and loses an eye, and more importantly, an arm. In all these stories, the main character has connections to Mike. Alec goes through an animatronic taking over his body like Mike with Leonard, Devin has nightmares like Mike does in FNaF 4, Oswald for the reasons I've already explained, and Pete has the gum thing and his hand turns purple. It's always an arm. With these 4 characters who have connections to Mike, it's always an arm. In Step Closer, it's the most abundant, and that's the story most people seem to think definitively proves Mike is Foxy Bro. This story, though, brings the arm connection throughout these 4 stories back around to Foxy, a character who has a hook for a hand. Remember how it's specifically Pete's hand that turns purple? It's simultaneously showing that he is Michael and is connected with Foxy. And the fact that these characters, all associated with Michael, maintain this arm connection, this Foxy connection, help to further that. It's also worth noting that 2 out of these 4 stories with the arm connection are about Michael characters who also have big connections to Foxy, like Alec with the Yarg Foxy, also Alec who dresses up as Foxy like Foxy Bro, or Pete who literally scares his younger brother with Foxy. And the other 2 stories are just as interesting, because in The New Kid, the story is literally about a bully killing someone with Golden Freddy, and then Golden Freddy attacks him by biting his arm, connecting him to Foxy Bro and also connecting him to Mike as well. And in Into the Pit, as I've said, Oswald's dad turns into Spring Bonnie, turns into William Afton, implying that he is Mike. Or at least one of William's kids. But anyway, let's move on. Number 10. When Spring Bonnie dies, the suit becomes lifeless, and it becomes an empty, hollow yellow rabbit suit and nothing more. This is the same thing that happens to Eleanor when she's trapped in her own memories in the final epilogue. This makes sense, since Eleanor stores her victims in her sticky balls.
Guys, yo, who the hell said that?
But those were all the details I found in Into the Pit. So now, let's talk about the theory I have about the story. To anyone who hasn't watched the Flash TV show, I'm going to explain one of the plot points from Season 1 of the show. Cisco and Joe are trying to solve the 15-year-old case about Barry's mother's murder, going back to the house where it occurred, where someone new now lived there. Not many people were interested in buying a house where a murder took place, but this lady did. Looking at pictures of the old house, Cisco and Joe find that basically everything in the house had been replaced. It was all different to how it was those 15 years ago, except for one thing: a mirror. A mirror that had been there the night Barry's mother died. A mirror that watched the Reverse Flash and the Flash fighting, and a mirror that watched the Reverse Flash murder Nora Allen. Then they somehow get photos from this goddamn mirror and find blood on the wall revealing Barry in the future time travels to the past to the night his mom died, whatever. That's really stupid, getting photos from a goddamn mirror. That's not the important part. Anyway, let's move on. The important part is that despite everything else in the house changing, this mirror is the one thing that stayed. Now coming back to Into the Pit, the ball pit is exactly the same as that mirror from the Flash. See, in Epilogue 10, it's revealed that after the missing children incident, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza gets shut down. A huge list of people buy the place, but they never keep it for long. We got a couple examples of this, like Papa Bear's Pancakes or whatever it's called, I forgot, and of course Jeff's Pizza itself. But there's another location that almost definitely connects to this. And I now present to you Find Player 2, where after Freddy's closes, the building is reused and turns into Flo's Fabulous Eatery. Find Player 2 doesn't have anything really connecting it to the stage line unless you take this into account. There were a lot of locations opened up in the place of Freddy's, and it would add up if one of those locations happened to be Flo's. The reason these locations don't last long, and why Jeff's Pizza eventually bit the dust, is because no one wants to be associated with the place that had kids murdered in it. But this Freddy's location closed after the MCI and became something different afterwards. But if we look at the games, the FNaF 1 location was the original Freddy's building reused. The reason they did this was because they'd basically gone bankrupt after the complete abysmal failure that was FNaF 2, having to use their original building and original animatronics. That doesn't make sense if they had to buy back the building. I'll leave it up to you to decide what that means. But either way, the fact that no one wants to be associated with Fazbear Entertainment does match up with what we see in all three universes. The FNaF 1 location was a success from the perspective of the public eye, but from a business side, Henry wanted to leave the company and no one wanted to buy the company, which is why it failed when it came to the business side of things. And in the Silverez trilogy, Afton explains that the mall was built around Freddy's, but it ended up being shut down because no one wanted to buy it. Going back to the Stitch line, the rest of the place is closed down, likely because a new Eleanor victim popped up and it went off to the next buyer. But that's all for this video. I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, then please do leave a like and subscribe if you want to. Tomorrow will be my video on the Fazbear Frights graphic novel, so keep an eye out for that. And I also start school tomorrow, which... yay! But either way, I still got some theories in the planning stage right now. I'll probably make a poll of which one you guys want to see first. In fact, by the time this video comes out, I've probably already done it, so if you haven't already, go vote in that poll. But that's all, and I'll see you guys tomorrow with the Fazbear Frights graphic novel video.